Thankwall's nose twitched. The billowing cloud of smoke from the machine almost filled the chamber now, and Thankwall was pretty sure that the device was not supposed to be emitting great showers of sparks like that. The fact that two of the warp engineers were running for the door wasn't a good sign either. He considered following them. "I have foreseen the presence, ill-omened elements in your future. Then I predict disaster for you unless do something about them." Suddenly, Thankwall was rooted to the spot, torn between his desire to flee and his desire to hear more. He almost squirted the musk of fear. If the Seer Lord prophesied something, then it had almost as good of happened. Unless, of course, his superior was lying to him for purposes of his own. That happened all too often, as Thankwall knew only too well. "Disaster, lordly one?" "Yes. See a dwarf and a human. Destinies are intertwined with yours. You do not slay them, then." There was a very loud and final bang. Thankwall threw himself off his stool and cowered on the floor. An acrid taste filled his mouth. Slowly, the smoke cleared, and he saw the fused and melted remains of the fast squeaking machine. Several dead Skaven slaves lay in its midst, their fur all charred and their whiskers burned away. In one corner, a warp engineer lay curled up in a ball, mewling and writhing in a state of shock. Thankwall was unconcerned about their fate. The Seer Lord's words filled him with great fear. He wished he had been able to speak with his superior a little longer, but alas, he had not that option. He raised his little bronze bell and tinkled it. Slowly, members of his bodyguard entered the chamber. Claw leader Gazat looked almost disappointed to see him alive, Thankwall thought. Briefly, the idea that the warrior might have sabotaged the fast squeaker crossed Thankwall's mind. He dismissed it. Gazat did not have the imagination. Anyway, the Grey Seer had more important things to worry about. "Summon the gutter runners," Thankwall squeaked in his most authoritative tone. "I have work for them." For a moment, silence fell over the chamber. A foul smell made Thankwall's whiskers twitch. Just the mere mention of the dreaded assassins of Clan Eshin had caused Claw leader Gazat to squirt the musk of fear. "Quick, quick," Thankwall added. "Instantly, master," Gazat said sadly, and scuttled off into the labyrinth of sewers. Thankwall rubbed his paws in glee. The gutter runners would not fail. Of that, he was assured. Felix unlocked the door of his chamber and entered his room. He yawned widely. He wanted for nothing more than to lie down on his pallet and sleep. He had been working for more than 12 hours. He put the lantern down beside the straw-filled mattress and unlaced his jerkin. He tried to give his surroundings as little attention as was possible, but it was difficult to ignore the loud moans of passion coming from the next room and the singing of the drinkers downstairs. The chamber wasn't good enough for paying guests, but it suited him well enough. He had occupied better, but this one had the great virtue of being free. It came with the job. Like a minority of old Hines' staff, Felix chose to live on the premises. Felix's little pile of possessions stood in one corner, under the barred window. There was his chainmail jerkin and little rucksack, which contained a few odds and ends such as his fire-making kit. Felix threw himself down on the bed and pulled his old, tattered woolen cloak over himself. He made sure his sword was within easy reach. His hard life on the road had made him wary even in seemingly safe places, and he thought that the Skaven they had recently encountered might still be about, filled him with dread. He recalled only too well the huge corpse of the slain rat ogre lying at the foot of the stairs in von Hallstatt's mansion. It had not been a reassuring sight. Somehow, he was unsurprised that he had heard nothing at all about the fire at von Hallstatt's mansion. Perhaps the authorities had not found the Skaven bodies, or perhaps there was a cover-up. Right now, Felix didn't even want to consider it. Felix wondered how men could ignore the tales of the Skaven. Even as a student, he had come across scholarly tomes proving that they didn't exist, or that if they had ever existed, they were now extinct. He had come across a few references to them in connection with the Great Plague of 1111, and of course, the emperor of that period was known as Mandred Skavenslayer. Yet, that was all. There were innumerable books written about elves and dwarves and orcs, yet knowledge of the Ratmen was rare. He could almost have suspected an organized conspiracy to cloak them in secrecy, but that thought was too disturbing, so he pushed it aside. There was a soft knock at the door. Felix lay still and tried to ignore it. Probably just one of the drunken patrons lost and looking for his room again, he told himself. The knock came again, more urgently and insistently this time. Felix rose from the bed and snatched up his sword. A man could never be too careful in these dark times. Perhaps some bravo lurked out there and thought a sleep-fuddled Felix would prove easy prey. Only 2 months ago, Hines had found a murdered couple lying on blood-stained sheets a mere 3 doors away. The man had been a prominent wine merchant, the girl his teenage mistress. Hines suspected that the merchant had been slain by assassins on order of his harridan of a wife, but claimed also that it was none of his business. Felix had got his new tunic all covered in blood when he dumped the bodies in the river. He hadn't been too thrilled about having to use the secret route through the sewers either. The knocking came a 3rd time, and he heard a woman's voice whisper, "Felix?" Felix eased his blade from its scabbard. Just because he heard a girl's voice didn't mean that there was only a girl waiting for him out there. She might have brought a few burly friends who would set about him as soon as he opened the door. Briefly, he considered not opening the door at all, of simply waiting until the girl and her friends tried to batter the door down. Then he realized quite how paranoid he had become. He shrugged. Since the deaths of Hef and Spider and the rest of the sewer watch, he had every reason to be paranoid. Still, was he going to wait there all night? He slipped the bolts and opened the door. Alyssa was waiting there. She looked up at him nervously, brushing a curl from her forehead. She was very short, but really very pretty indeed, Felix decided. I wanted to thank you for helping me earlier," she said eventually. Felix thought that it was a bit late for that. Couldn't she have waited until the morning? Slowly, though, realization dawned on him. "It was nothing," he muttered, feeling his face flush. Alyssa glanced quickly left and right down the corridor. Aren't you going to invite me in? I wanted to thank you properly. She had to stand on her tiptoes to kiss his lips. He stood there, dumbfounded for a second, then pulled her into the room and slammed the door, slipping the lock into place. As his henchling, Queg, reached 12 in his muttered count, Chang Squick of Clan Eshin twitched his nose and sampled the smells of the night. Strange, he thought. So like the stinks of the man-cities of far Cathay, and yet so unlike. Here he could smell beef and turnip and roast pig. In the east it would have been pickled cabbage and rice and chicken. The food smelled different, but everyone else was the same. There was the same sense of overflowing sewers, of many humans living in close proximity, of incense and perfume. He opened his ears as his master had trained him as well. He heard temple bells tolling and the rattle of carriage wheels on cobbles. He heard the singing of drunks and the call of the night watchmen as they shouted the hour. It did not trouble him. He could not be distracted. He could, if he so wished, tune out all extraneous sound and pick out one voice in a crowd. The Skaven squinted out into the darkness. His night vision was keen. Down there were the shadowy shapes of men and women leaving the taverns arm in arm, heading for brief liaisons in back alleys and squalid rooming houses. Chang did not care about them at all. His two targets were in the building that humans called a tavern. He did not know why the Honourable Grey Seer had selected these two, out of all the inferior souls in the city, for inevitable death. He merely knew it was his task to ease the passing of their souls into the maw of the Horned Rat. He had already offered up 2 sticks of narcotic incense and pledged their immortal essence for his dark god's feast. He could almost, but not quite, feel sorry for the doomed ones. They were there in that tavern, under the sign of the Blind Pig, and they did not know that a certain doom approached. Nor would they, for Chang Squick had trained for years in the delivery of silent death. Long before he had left the warm jungles of his eastern homeland to serve the Council of 13 in these cold western climes, he had been schooled to perfection in his clan's ancient art of stealthy assassination. While still a runt, he had been made to run bare-pawed through beds of white-hot coals and snatch coins from the bowls of blind beggars in human cities. Even at that early age, he had learned that the beggars were often far from blind, and often viciously proficient in the martial arts. By the time of his initiation, he had become proficient in all forms of unarmed combat. He was a 3rd-degree adept in the way of the Crimson Talon and held a black belt in the path of the deadly paw. He had spent 12 long months being trained in silent infiltration in the jungles, and a month in fasting and meditation high atop Mount Yellowfang with only his own droppings for food. Since that time, he had killed and killed again in the name of the Council of 13. He had slain Lord Kitjor of Clan Gulcher when that mighty warlord had plotted the downfall of Throp the Unclean. He had served as personal assistant to Snitch when the great assassin had killed Frederick Hasselhoffen and his entire household, and he had been rewarded with one-on-one instruction by the Deathmaster himself. Chang Quick's list of triumphs was long, and tonight he would add another to it. It was his task to slay the dwarf, Gotrek and his human henchling, Felix Jaeger. He did not see how he could fail. What chance had a one-eyed dwarf and his stupid human friend against a mighty Skaven trained in every art of death-dealing? Chang Squick felt confident that he could take the pair himself. He had been almost insulted by Grey Seer Thankwell's insistence that he take his full pack of gutter runners. Surely, the dire rumours of this dwarf were exaggerated. The Troll Slayer could not possibly have slaughtered a unit of storm vermin single-handed, and it seemed well nigh unbelievable that he could have slain the rat ogre Bone Ripper without the aid of an entire company of mercenaries. And, of course, it was impossible that this could be the same dwarf who 5 years ago had slain Warlord Makrik of Clan Gauja at the Battle of the Third Door. Chang exhaled in one long, controlled breath. Perhaps the Grey Seer was right. He had often proved to be so in the past. It was simple prudence to assign the task of slaying the dwarf to Slither. Chang would slay the human, and if there were any difficulties, he would race to the assistance of his henchling's squad. Not that there would be any difficulties. Quaig stopped counting at 100 and tapped his superior on the arm. Chang lashed his tail once to show that he understood. Slither and his team, with the clockwork precision which characterized all Skaven operations, would be in position at the secret entrance to the tavern by now. It was time to proceed. He loosened his swords in their scabbards, checked to make sure that his blowpipe and throwing stars were ready at paw, and whistled the signal to advance. Like a dark wave, the pack of gutter runners surged forward over the rooftop. Their blackened weapons were visible only as shadowy outlines in the moon's light. Not a weapon clinked. Not an outline was visible. Well, almost. Hines made his last rounds of the night, checking the doors and windows of the lower floor to make sure they were securely barred. It was amazing how often thieves tried to break into the Blind Pig and steal from its cellars. Not even the reputation for ferocity of Hines's bouncers could keep the desperately poor and alcoholic denizens of the New Quarter from making the attempt. It was quite pathetic, really. He made his way down into the cellars, shining his light into the dark corners between the great ale barrels and wine racks. He could have sworn he heard a strange scuttling noise down there. Just his imagination, he told himself. He was getting old, starting to hear things. Even so, he went over and checked the secret door that led down into the sewers. It was hard to tell in this light, but it looked undisturbed. He doubted anybody had used it since he and Felix had dumped those bodies 2 months back and saved everybody quite a scandal. Yes, he was just getting old. That was all. He turned and limped back to the stairwell. His bad leg was playing up tonight. It always did when there was going to be rain. Hines smiled grimly, remembering how he'd got the old war wound. It had been stamped on by a Bretonian charger at the Battle of Red Orc Pass. Clean break. He remembered lying there in the bloody dirt and thinking it was probably a just payback for spiking the horse's owner on his own halberd. That had been a bad time, one of the worst he had faced in all his years of soldiering. He'd learned a lot about pain that day. Still, there had been good times as well as bad during his career as a mercenary. He was forced to admit that. There were occasions when Hines wondered whether he had made the right decision, giving up the free-spirited life of the mercenary companies for the life of a tavern keeper. On nights like this, he missed the camaraderie of his old unit, the drinking around the campfires, the swappings of stories and recounting of tales of heroism. Hines had spent 10 years as a halberdier and had seen service on half the battlefields of the Empire, first as a lowly trooper and later as a sergeant. He had risen to captain during Emperor Karl Franz's campaigns against the Orc hordes in the east. During the last Bretonnian scrap, he had made enough in plunder to buy the blind pig. He had finally given in to old Lot's promptings to settle down and make a life for the two of them. His old comrades had laughed when he had actually married a camp follower. They had insisted she would run off with all his money. Instead, the two of them had been blissfully happy for 5 years before old Lot had to spoil it all by going and dying of the wasting sickness. He still missed her. He wondered if there was anything to stay here in Nong for now. His family were all dead. Lottie was gone. As he reached the head of the stair, Hines thought he heard the scuttling sound again. There was definitely something moving down there. Briefly, he considered calling Gotrek or some of the other lads and getting them to investigate. Then he spread his huge hands wide in a gesture of disgust. He really was getting old if he would let the noise of some rats scrabbling around in his cellar upset him. He could just imagine what the others would say if he told them he was scared to go down there himself. They would laugh like drains. He drew the thick kosh from his waistband and turned to go back down. Now he really was uneasy. He would never have drawn the weapon normally. He was too calm and easy-tempered. Something definitely did have him spooked. His old soldier's instincts were aroused, and they had saved him on no more than one occasion. He could still remember that night along the Kislevite border when he had somehow been unable to get to sleep, filled with a terrible sense of foreboding. He had risen from his bed and gone to replace the sentry, only to find the man dead at his post. He had only just roused the camp before the foul beastmen attacked. He had a similar feeling in the pit of his stomach now. He hesitated at the top of the stair. Best go get Gotrek, he thought. Only the real hardcore drinkers were still in the tavern by now. The rest were asleep, under the tables, in the alcoves, in the private rooms, or else gone home. There it was again, that skittering sound, like the soft scrabble of padded claws on the stone stairs. Hines was definitely worried now. He pulled the door closed and turned, almost running down the corridor until he came out in the main bar area. A handful of the bouncers chatted idly with a few of the barmaids. "Where's Gotrek?" Hines asked. A burly lad, helmet, jerked his thumb in the direction of the privies. Slither reached the head of the staircase and flung the door open. So far, so good. All was going like a typically well-oiled clan scryer machine. Everything according to plan. They had entered the tavern undetected. Now it was simply a case of searching the place until they came upon the dwarf and killed him, and furthermore, killed anything else that got in their way, of course. Slither felt a little irritated. It was typical of his superior to take the easy task. They had already found out where the human Jaeger slept, and their leader had taken the task of killing him for himself. Surely that was the only explanation. It could not be that the great Chang Squick was afraid of an encounter with the Trollslayer. Not that Slither cared. When he dispatched the feared dwarf, it would simply reflect all the more to his credit. He gestured for his fellows to go in first. "Quick, quick," he chittered. "All night we haven't got." The gutter runners moved quickly into the corridor. Felix and Alyssa lay on his pallet, kissing deeply, when suddenly Felix shifted uneasily. He thought he heard the faintest of scrabbling sounds from outside the window. He gently untangled Alyssa's arms from around him, and was suddenly aware of the area of heat and sweat where their bodies met. He looked down on the serving girl's face. Her face was a little puffed on the left side from where the student had hit her, but she really was very pretty. "What is it?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. He listened for a moment and heard nothing. "Nothing," he said, and began kissing her again. Slither bounded down the corridor. He smelled dwarf. He followed the scent, whistling commands to his fellows in the fore. Surprised by Skaven's stealth, speed and savagery, their weak foe would swiftly be dragged down. What chance would a mere dwarf have against the deadliest warriors of the master race? Slither almost felt sorry that he was in the rear, the traditional position of honor any Skaven leader adopted whenever possible. He would have liked a chance to be the first to sink his blade into the dwarf and offer up his soul to the horned rat. They reached the end of the corridor. The stench of dwarf intensified. He must be very close now. Slither's heart rate accelerated dramatically. Blood raced through his veins. His tail stiffened and lashed. The claws in his feet extruded instinctively. As he made ready for combat, he bared his fangs in a snarl. The scent was very strong. They must be almost on top of the Trollslayer. His warriors lashed their tails proudly, ready to overwhelm their opponent with their numbers and savagery. Suddenly, a red mist filled Slither's eyes. It looked as if a huge axe had cut Cliffsqueak in half, but that could not be. They could not have been detected. It was impossible that a mere dwarf would have the cunning to ambush a pack of Skaven gutter runners. And yet, suddenly, Rishak was squeaking in pain and terror. A huge fist had caught him by the throat. The butt of a monstrous axe cracked his skull. The thick, cloying scent of the musk of fear filled the air now. Cliffsqueak's body had already started to dissolve into a puddle of black slime as the Clan Eshin decomposition spells took effect. Slither looked out into a swirling melee where half a dozen of his finest gutter runners were attempting to swarm over a massive dwarfish form. His pale, hairless flesh was emphasized by the black of the Skaven's cloaks. Slither saw the huge axe swing around in a deadly arc. He heard bones crunch and brains splatter. "Try to sneak up on me, would you?" muttered the dwarf in Reichspiel. He added a guttural curse in Dwarfish as he clove a path of red ruin through the Skaven assassins. The dwarf bellowed and chanted a strange war cry as he fought. Slither shuddered. The noise was enough to awaken the dead, or at least any sleeping human guards. He felt the advantage of stealth and surprise slipping away. His eyes widened with terror as he watched the dwarf complete his bloody work, cutting down Snicket and Blodge with one stroke. Suddenly, Slither realized that he was alone, facing one very angry and very dangerous dwarf. It was impossible to believe, but the dwarf had killed most of his brethren in a matter of seconds. Nothing in all the world, not even a clan assassin of Clan Eshin, could conceivably be so deadly. Slither turned to flee, but a hobnail boot descended on his tail, pinning him in place. Tears of pain filled Slither's eyes. The musk of fear voided from his glands. The last thing he heard was the whoosh of a huge axe coming closer. Despite himself, Felix untangled himself from Alyssa again and looked around. What was that noise? It sounded like fighting downstairs. He was sure he could recognize Gotrek's deep-throated battle cry. The girl was looking up at him, puzzled, wondering why he had stopped kissing her. She opened her mouth to speak. Felix placed a hand gently over her lips. He leaned forward until his mouth was over her ear. "Be very quiet," he whispered. A cold trickle of fear ran through him. He could definitely hear a strange scrabbling sound coming from over by the window. Felix lifted himself off the recumbent girl and reached for his dragon-hilted sword. He slipped backwards off the straw pallet and fell into a half-crouch. Placing one finger against his lips to indicate she should be quiet, he gestured for the woman to get up off the bed. She stared at him uncertainly, then followed his gaze over to the window. That was when she screamed. Chang Squick watched as Noi swung down on the rope. He felt almost proud of his pupil. Noi had fixed the grapnel in the guttering perfectly, then abseiled down the side of the tavern like a great spider. He had sprayed the metal bars covering the window with acid, then filed through the weakened iron like a master burglar. He reached up and gestured to the rest of the squad on the tavern roof. They fixed their ropes in position and made ready to follow Noi. Chang would be last in, as befitted the glorious strike leader. Noi kicked himself back from the wall, swinging out into space, gaining momentum to crash through the window. The window caved in and a black-clad Skaven crashed through it. It hit the floor, rolling and emerged into a fighting crouch, tail lashing, a long curved blade glinting evilly in each claw. Felix didn't wait for it to get time to orientate itself. He lashed forward with his own blade, almost catching the thing by surprise. Sparks flashed as the creature parried, deflecting Felix's blade so that it only seared along his cheek. "Run, Alyssa!" Felix shouted. "Get out!" For a moment, he thought the girl was too shocked to move. She lay on the straw pallet, her eyes wide with horror. Then suddenly, she sprang up. The distraction almost killed Felix. The moment he took to look at her was a moment he did not have to look at his opponent. Only the deadly whine of the Skaven's blade as it darted towards his skull warned him. He ducked his head, and the sword passed over him, coming close enough to shave a lock off his hair. Felix lashed back instinctively. The Skaven sprang away. "Felix!" Alyssa shouted. "Run! Get help!" Over the Skaven's shoulder, He could see other feral forms crowding round the window. They seemed to be struggling to force a way in, each getting in the other's way. The window was packed with mangy, scarred Skaven faces. Things did not look good.
Die, foolish man-thing,
the Skaven chittered, bounding forward. It feinted a stroke with its right blade, then lashed out with its left. Felix caught its hand just above the wrist and immobilized it. The thing's tail snaked obscenely around his leg and tried to trip him. Felix brought the pommel of his sword down behind the Skaven's ear. It fell forward, but even as it did so, struck with its blade, forcing Felix to jump away. He bounded back across the room and skewered the Skaven as it started to rise. Blood frothed from the foul thing's lips as it died. A strange reeking stink filled the air. The Skaven's flesh started to bubble and rot. Felix heard Alyssa throw the door bolts. He risked a glance at her. She had turned and was looking at him in a mixture of horror and confusion, as if she did not know whether to leave him or stay. "Go," he shouted. "Get help. There's nothing you can do here." She vanished through the doorway, leaving Felix feeling obscurely relieved. At least now he wasn't responsible for her safety. As he turned to look back, he saw that the other Skaven he had killed was gone. He had left behind only a pool of black slime and its rotting clothing. Felix wondered what deadly sorcery was at work. A hiss of displaced air warned him of another threat. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of several glittering objects hurtling towards him. He dived forward, aiming for the bed, hoping it would break his fall. His mouth filled with straw from the mattress as he landed. He fumbled with his left hand for his old red cloak and pulled its wadded mass up in his left fist. He was just in time. More shining objects spun through the air towards him. He brought the cloak up and they impacted in the rolled thick wool. Something sharp penetrated the cloth just between his fingers. Felix looked down. He saw a throwing star smeared with some foul reddish substance, doubtlessly poison. 2 more Skaven had extricated themselves from the mass outside the window and dropped into the room below. They scuttled towards him with eye-blinding speed, evil shadows of man-sized rats, their yellow fangs glistening in the lantern light. He knew better now than to even glance at the doorway. There was no way he could reach it without taking a blade in his back. "Why me?" he asked himself. "Why am I standing here half naked and alone, facing a pack of Skaven assassins? Why do these things always happen to me? This sort of thing never happened to Sigmar in the legends." He threw the cloak over the head of the oncoming Skaven. It writhed in the tangle of woolen folds. Felix ran his blade through it. His razor-sharp sword cut through flesh like butter. Black blood soiled the garment. Felix struggled to pull the blade free. The second rat thing took advantage of his preoccupation and sprang forward. Both blades held high, swinging downwards like butcher's cleavers. Felix threw himself backwards. The blade came free with an awful sucking sound. He landed flat on his back, his sword clutched in his hand. He raised its point, and the flying Skaven impaled itself on it. As it fell, its weight pulled the blade free from Felix's grasp. "Damn," he thought, rising to his feet, weaponless. The point of his blade was visible, protruding from the Skaven's back. He was reluctant to touch the foul beast with his naked flesh, but he had no choice if he wanted the blade. His cloak was already starting to flatten as the Skaven decomposed with terrifying rapidity. Too late. More Skaven leapt in through the window. There was no time for any qualms. He picked up the Skaven's sword and charged. The sheer fury of his rush took the Skaven by surprise. He cleaved one skull before it could react and disemboweled another with his return stroke. It fell, trying to hold in its ropey guts with one claw, even as it attempted to strike Felix with the other. Felix hacked at it again, severing the limb. He cut around him in blind fury, feeling the terrible shock of impact run up his arm from every blow. Slowly, though, more and more Skaven pressed into the room, and remorselessly defending himself as best he could every step of the way, his back was pressed towards the wall. Hines looked up in surprise as Gotrek stomped into the bar. In one hand he held his blood-smeared axe. His other huge fist clutched a dead Skaven by the scruff of the neck. The thing was decomposing at a frightening rate, seemingly undergoing weeks of decomposition in just moments. Gotrek glared around at the surprised bouncers with his one good eye and dropped the body. It squelched and formed a puddle at his feet.
"Bloody Skaven,"
he muttered.
"Whole bunch of them lurking just outside the privy. Too stupid to know dwarfs had good ears."
Hines moved over to stand by the Trollslayer. He looked down at the pool of rot with a peculiar mixture of fascination and distaste written on his features. "That's a Skaven, all right." Gotrek looked up at him in surprise.
"Of course it's a bloody Skaven. I've killed enough of them in my time to know what they look like by now."
Hines shrugged apologetically. Then he swiveled on his heels as a scream emerged from the top of the stairwell. Hines looked up in surprise at the partially clad form of Alyssa appearing at the head of the stairs. The girl looked pale with terror.
"Felix!"
she shouted.
"What has Felix done, girl?"
he asked soothingly. She threw herself at him. He enfolded her shivering form with his brawny arms.
"No, they're trying to kill him. Monsters are trying to kill Felix. They're in his room." "Has that girl been taking weird route?"
a bouncer asked placidly. Hines looked over at Gotrek and the rest of the bouncers. All his earlier forebodings returned. He remembered the scrabbling in the cellars. He could see that the dwarf was having the same thought as he.
"What are we doing standing here?"
Hines roared.
"Follow me, lads."
This was better. This was more like the old days. Felix knew that he was doomed. There was no way he could fight all these Skaven. There were too many of them, and they were too fast. If he had been wearing his chainmail shirt, perhaps he would have some chance of surviving all those stabbing blades, but he wasn't. His foes sensed victory and advanced. Felix danced in the center of a whirlwind of stabbing blades. Somehow he managed to survive with only a few nicks and scratches. He found himself standing beside his bed. Thinking quickly, he kicked the lantern over. Oil spilled out onto the straw and lit it. In an instant, a wall of flames separated him from the ratmen. He reached out and grabbed the nearest one, hurling it into the flames. The Skaven shrieked in agony as its fur caught fire. It began to roll around on the floor, howling and squeaking. Its fellows leapt back to avoid its blazing form. Felix knew he had brought himself only a moment's breathing space. He knew now there were only one chance. Doing what the Skaven least expected, he dived directly through the flames. Heat scorched his flesh. He smelled the stink of his own singed hair. He saw a gap in the Skaven line near the door and dived through it, almost slamming into the corridor wall. Heart pounding, breath rasping in his lungs, blood pouring from a dozen nicks, he raced for the head of the stairs, as if all the hounds of chaos were at his heels. A head poked out from the room next door. He recognized the bald head and lantrop whiskers of Baron Joseph Mann, one of the Blind Pig's most dedicated customers.
"What the hell's going on up there?"
the old nobleman shouted.
"Sounds like you're performing unnatural acts with animals."
"Something like that," Felix retorted as he sprinted past. The old man saw what was following him. His eyes went wide. He clutched his chest and fell. Chang Squick glanced out round the doorway and gnawed the tip of his tail in frustration. It was all going wrong. It was all going wrong from the moment that Fool Noi had swung in through the window. In their enthusiasm to be part of the kill, the rest of the pack had all tried to get in behind him at once, all eager to claim their share of the glory. Of course, their lines had become entangled, and they had all ended up clutching the windowsill and each other frantically, trying to scuttle into the room. Several of the idiots had fallen to their deaths on the hard ground below. Serves the fools right. It was ever the fate of great Skaven captains to be let down by incompetent underlings, he thought philosophically. Not even the most brilliant plan could survive being executed by witless cretins. It was starting to look like his entire command consisted of those. They could not even kill a single feeble manling, even with all their advantages of surprise, numbers, and superior Skaven armament. It made him want to spit with frustration. Personally, he suspected treachery. Perhaps rivals in the clan had sent him a bunch of ill-trained louts in order to discredit him. All in all, that seemed the most likely explanation. Briefly, Chang considered taking a hand in the fray himself, but only briefly. It was glaringly obvious to his superior intellect what was going to happen next. The entire tavern would be roused, and his underlings would soon encounter stiff and very likely fatal resistance. Let them get on with it, Chang thought. They deserve whatever fate befalls them. He slid back into the room, petulantly threw some of the manliest clothing on the fire to add to the blaze, and then leapt out the window. He caught the climbing line easily in one hand and swarmed up the side of the building to safety. Already, he was considering what would be the best way to report this minor setback to Grey Seer Thankwell. Hines grunted as something slammed into him. He almost toppled backwards as the weight hit him.
"Sorry,"
said a polite voice that Hines recognized as belonging to Felix Jaeger. "I was having a little trouble back there." Throwing stars whizzed past Hines' ear. The smell of burning filled his nostrils. He looked down a corridor crowded with scurrying ratmen. A cold fury filled him. Those cursed Skaven were trying to burn down the blind pig and rob him of his livelihood. He pulled out his kosh and made to rush forward. He need not have bothered. Gotrek pushed him to one side and charged headlong into the throng. The rest of the bouncers advanced cautiously behind him. From the far end of the corridor, various nobles and their bodyguards emerged and slammed into the Skaven from the rear. Terrible carnage began. It was all over very soon. Felix sat in front of the fire, wrapped in a blanket and shivering. He looked across at Alyssa. The girl smiled back at him warmly. All around, the bouncers hurried upstairs with buckets of water, making sure that the fire did not spread from Felix's room.
"I thought you were very brave,"
Alyssa said. There was a look of complete doting admiration in her eye.
"Just like a hero in one of those Detlef Sierck dramas."
Felix shrugged. He was tired. He was riddled with dozens of cuts and bruises, and he knew now that the Skaven were definitely trying to kill him. He didn't feel very heroic. Still, he thought, things could be worse. He reached out and put an arm around Alyssa's shoulder and drew her to him. She snuggled in close. "Thank you," he said, and for a moment, the girl's smile made everything feel more worthwhile. That was the end of Chapter 2. The next chapter is titled Night Raid. It is a frightening thing to be sought by enemies unknown, invisible and untraceable, who can strike at you when they will without fear of vengeance or punishment. At least I found it to be so. If my companion shared these feelings, he never gave any sign of it to me. Indeed, he seemed rather to enjoy the situation, which I suppose was natural enough, given that his avowed purpose in life was to seek a violent death. Yet I was worried. The attack on the alehouse had left me shaken, and the knowledge that somewhere out there in the night an implacable foe was lurking did nothing to calm my fraught nerves. But it seemed that we had allies as well, who were determined to aid us for their own unfathomable purposes. From My Travels with Gotrek, Volume 3, by Herr Felix Jäger, in the Altdorf Press, the year 2505.